So by the time that we get to the opening of the book, I believe the first chapter is titled "The Unsolvable Problem." What is the unsolvable problem? Maybe not even just the context of just America, but perhaps it applies to the whole world right now over the last 5 decades or so.
Yeah, so as capital gets more mobile, as it becomes easier for very wealthy people and firms to move money and jobs from place to place, their power increases at the expense of the power of people who are less mobile and whose money is less mobile. States are territorial. They are very, very immobile. So as the ability of people to move money around the world increases, they can say to states, well, why should I move money to where you are? I could move money somewhere else just as easily. What are you going to give me in exchange for me parking my money there? And what they tend to get are lower tax rates, weaker labor laws, weakened labor unions, lower wages, weaker regulations. States are in this competitive game with each other to attract money and jobs, and this game exercises a constant gravitational pull on their policy. And so what is unsolvable about this is that the more you make capital mobile, the stronger these competitive incentives become. It gets harder and harder to defy the incentives. And as capital becomes more mobile, you get all these supply chains. And these supply chains become very costly to disrupt. So in a situation where there is very little trade, like immediately after World War II, there's an opportunity for states to go, okay, we're going to allow trade to happen. We're going to allow you to move money around, but here are the rules. Since we're turning back on the taps, we're deciding what the rules will be for our turning back on the taps. Once the taps are running and people are accustomed to buying all sorts of stuff at very low prices, if you disrupt that and generate inflation or generate shortages of things, that will make people very unhappy, and that will cause them to vote against you in elections. So democratic governments find that if they try to disrupt this system for the purposes of redistributing wealth or rearranging the distribution of wealth and power, that they will pay an enormous near-term cost for that. At the same time, if they try to club together with other states and negotiate and come together to create another system, the issue is that it's very easy for some states to defect and to try to take advantage of any block of states that try to set minimum standards. So even in the case of something like the European Union or the United States, where you have a very large block, it's still the case that there are many, many states that are outside of those blocks that play all kinds of games with their tax rates. And even within these blocks, within the range of possible policies, you'll see, say, a state like Texas that will run its tax rates down as low as it can to siphon jobs and money from California. Or you'll see in Europe a state like Germany that will use flexible labor markets to siphon jobs and investment from a state like, say, France. And then when things are not going so well in California, or things are not going so well in France or Italy, you'll see Texas or Germany go, this is because you don't have a competitive system. You need to change your system and get more competitive and become more like us. So in the book, I am exploring, how do you actually make a world that's better for the people who labor so that other people can write when there is this enormous amount of capital mobility? Can you make new rules that govern it? Can you break it up in some way so that the system can be redesigned? It's very, very difficult to do, in part because the more mobile capital becomes, the more powerful the oligarchs and corporations become that benefit from capital mobility. And even in periods when the distribution of power was a lot less slanted toward them than it is now, say the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the tendency was for oligarchs and corporations to succeed in pressing states to lower trade barriers and eventually to lower tax rates. And even in the 70s, when, say, the labor unions had double the density in the United States that they now have, ultimately those unions were not really able to outcompete oligarchs and corporations. And as the decades have worn on, the situation has only gotten worse and worse and worse and worse.
Is there a specific period that you would kind of like situate, I guess, the beginnings of this capital mobility? Because, I mean, he doesn't normally get talked about in these ways, but it does seem to me at this point that FDR was kind of like in some ways the first like real major neoliberal that at least America had, right? Part of how he was able to win the 1936 election was he basically got a huge voting bloc in Black America who essentially said, look, we don't trust FDR to not be racist, but we don't trust anybody else to not be racist. And yet he's actually offering something substantive to us that's going to improve our lives. So he was able to offer a lot, right? Dangle this carrot essentially. At the same time, what he also did was he essentially had an alliance with the business people that in exchange for this, in exchange for high tax rates and stuff like that, they now would have, access to markets outside of America, right? This is when really capital started kind of going abroad, and this, of course, yes, it did intensify with the decades. So, like, is there like any other period, or like when did this all happen, and what are the trends that occurred within?
Yeah, so if you were to go back to the Gilded Age in the 1890s, there was a substantial amount of capital mobility, not nearly as much as now, but a substantial amount by historical standards. That mobility was very heavily disrupted by the First World War. And the First World War also destroyed an enormous amount of old money, an enormous amount of wealth that was held by the old European families. And that disruption in mobility and that breakup of those centers of wealth and power that had previously existed created opportunities for new kinds of approaches. In the 20s, there was an effort to put this thing back together, but the system was never really fully put back together in the 20s. And then when the Depression hits, it completely breaks apart. You get a bunch of tariffs all over the place, lots of states tariffing each other. You get a very, very limited mobility of capital. States start rearming and approaching international politics in a militarily competitive fashion again. So much less trade in the 30s. And what that does is it creates an opportunity for policy leaders to try different and distinctive approaches from one another. And so you get this environment in the 30s where you have, say, the Nazi state that is trying its set of economic policies, the Soviet state, which is trying its set of economic policies, the United States under FDR trying its set, and these being very distinct and different ways of trying to manage the economy from the point of view of the state. All of that is possible because if you don't like what's going on in the United States, you can't easily take your money to the Soviet Union or take your money to Nazi Germany or even take your money to the UK during this time or to France. It becomes increasingly difficult to move money even within the states that we might think of today as the friendly states, the states that you'd expect there to be a lot of intercourse with. In the 30s, there just wasn't very much. And then in the 40s, when the war starts, again, there's enormous disruption and rationing and the state actively planning supplies of things. So as you come out of that, there's an opportunity to then redesign the system of international trade at the Bretton Woods Conference. And initially, the plan is to have something that limits substantially the amount of trade that takes place so that governments still have a lot of autonomy and can pursue different kinds of policy options. And throughout the Cold War, for instance, the amount of trade that goes on between the Soviet sphere and the Western sphere is almost nothing. And Soviet trade as a percentage of GDP is negligible. Within the Western sphere, there's a gradual increase in the amount of trade, with more and more post-colonial states getting admitted to the trade zone. So the trade zone getting bigger, and then the tariffs getting negotiated down repeatedly over and over and over again at these different rounds of trade talks. And as these tariffs get lowered and you integrate more states that are poorer, that have lower wage environments into the trade bloc, that creates this competitive incentive that slowly undercuts and undermines the position of the labor union-based Western worker. And this happens slowly over the course of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And in the 70s, it comes to a head. You start to get these inflationary spikes that are driven in large part by foreign policy crises, exogenous events, things like the oil shocks, the OPEC embargo, the fall of the Iranian regime, the fall of the Shah. These things kick up prices. And when they kick up prices, the oligarchs and corporations go, see, the problem with all of this is that the workers are getting paid too much money. They have too much leverage. And so we need to really undermine their ability to negotiate for higher wages, because otherwise this inflation will just keep going and keep going and keep going. And they're ultimately able to prevail in part through a little bit of economic luck. For instance, it's lucky for the right that the Iranian Revolution happens right in 1979, right before an election year in 1980. And that is going to create panic in the Carter administration, which is going to cause the Carter administration to move to the right, which is going, Jimmy Carter, for instance, appoints Paul Volcker chairman of the Federal Reserve. Volcker starts kicking up the interest rates in an election year. That, of course, means that Carter is going to lose badly to Reagan, and then Reagan will follow this policy further. Similarly, in the UK, Margaret Thatcher gets in 79 during this second inflationary spike associated with the fall of Iran. The fall of the Shah had, I think, very substantial effects in those countries. In some other Western countries, the process happens slower because parliamentary systems with proportional representation make it difficult for one party to establish a majority and pass sweeping reforms. So in a lot of European countries, the reforms are delayed or happen more slowly over the course of the 80s and 90s. And in many of these countries, the process is still ongoing. We're hearing about the process ongoing in France as we speak. So it happens at different rates in different places. But the more Britain and the United States go in this direction, the more that creates incentives that push other states that way. So Germany follows, and then once Germany follows, now that's a big pull on other states within the European Union. And the Euro crisis is very much a crisis about whether these states are going to follow Germany or continue to be disadvantaged in the trading relationship with Germany. What is to be done about Germany? Do you kick it out of the European Union? Do you yourself withdraw from the European Union? What do you do if you're a peripheral state like Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, or France, depending on how you choose to view France? That question was never really positively answered. All of the Southern European states that found themselves in that situation became very concerned that if they did try to do anything to meaningfully change the structure, that the near-term economic costs of doing that, say dumping the euro or leaving the European Union, would be enormous. And the UK, which tried leaving the European Union, even with its own currency already established, has seen that there's substantial economic cost to that and substantial fall in living standards as a consequence of exiting the trade bloc. And that's the case in the UK, even though the Brexit deal still preserves relatively low tariff trade between the UK and the European Union. And that happens in part because companies, when they look at this situation, go, why would I want to base in the UK when I could base in an EU member state and not have to deal with all the paperwork? If I want to work in English, why don't I go to Ireland, which also has a more favorable tax environment? The UK can adopt tax rates that are similar to Ireland's tax rates. But even if it does that, it doesn't have the easy access without all the paperwork that Ireland has. So it's in a losing game of trying to attract jobs and investment that otherwise will start to go to Dublin or they'll start to go to Frankfurt. And this is the game increasingly, and it's just getting played at more and more intense levels the further we go, because policymakers are finding that this drag on them is bigger really than anything else, than anything that we talk about, than any of the exogenous events that have happened in recent years. It's stronger than, it's not something that you can easily displace with COVID or the war in Ukraine. It takes a really, really large economic shock to actually disrupt capital mobility once it gets going. If you look at trade volumes with China, we talk all the time about a trade war between the United States and China, but the trade volume is still about as big as it was 5 years ago. It has not significantly reduced in size. Insofar as the United States does cut trade with China, it tends to just trade more with other poor states that have low wages and low tax and friendly environments for capital, like Vietnam. States that you might think of as communist states or states that would not be susceptible to this are completely susceptible to it. As soon as they get involved in the system of trade, it has this pull on them. And so even, say, Vietnam, a state which theoretically is still nominally committed to communism, will produce a favorable environment for capital if that can bring a lot of jobs and investment into Vietnam.